Hello and welcome to Mergers and Acquisitions, the podcast of the Society for Economic Anthropology. My name is Kelly McCowan, and I'm your host for our current series on unemployment. Last time, I spoke with Alana Gershon about her research on the new world of unemployment in the knowledge economy and the rise of the pandemic workplace. I described her work as a touchstone in the emergent anthropology of unemployment. But what exactly is this subfield? What are its primary questions, and what distinguishes it within the broader social science of unemployment? Today, I'm joined by two scholars who I think might have the answers. Jong Bum Kwon, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Webster University, and Carrie Lane, Professor of American Studies at Cal State Fullerton, are the editors of 2016's Anthropologies of Unemployment, New Perspectives on Work and Its Absence. This is, to my knowledge, the most fully realized attempt yet to promote and position unemployment as a central anthropological concern. With JB and Carrie, I want to revisit their volume from the perspective of the present, learn more about its origins, and where they see this subfield, the anthropology of unemployment, going. JB and Carrie, thank you so much for being on Mergers and Acquisitions.
Thank you so much for inviting us.
It's our pleasure.
So unemployment, as I've already said, has not traditionally been a keyword in American cultural anthropology. So how did it become a keyword for each of you?
I did not intend to study unemployment. I was very interested in questions of sort of how corporate culture was shifting following the dot-com crash. So when I was, for instance, starting graduate school, there was a lot of conversation around the future of work, and it was supposed to look like foosball tables and, parties on Friday, and sort of a very blurry boundary between work and social life. Right. And then I went into the field to study that, and it was 2001. And all of a sudden, first of all, not many companies in the midst of massive layoffs and closures wanted an anthropologist lurking around their hallways. But also, as I attended networking events, I was in Dallas, as I attended high-tech networking events, I realized that most of the people there were not actually working in high tech. Most of the people there were doing exactly what I was doing, which was trying to network our way into companies, me for research and them for employment. And I started over time to realize that the more interesting story about how work was changing was actually occurring outside of formal employment. And so that's how I sort of ended up writing my first book, A Company of One, which is an exploration of how people experienced unemployment in high tech in the years following 2001. So that's sort of how I accidentally fell into studies of unemployment.
That's so interesting. I think, in the conversations I've had with a number of folks that work in this area, they do seem to come to it accidentally in many cases. JB, how about you? How did you come to unemployment?
It's pretty similar. It was also an accident. I went to Korea to research factory workers, and I was very interested in these kind of company towns. And when I got there, the Asian financial crisis that happened from 97, and we were in the kind of the waning moments, I guess. But I realized that it was still an important part of the way that it was structuring the economy. So then I found myself meeting with, and then ultimately deciding to fully embrace this group of laid off auto workers in Pupyeong, South Korea. And so the focus wasn't on factory workers inside, it was the factory workers outside who were involved in a 2-year-long struggle to get their jobs back. And so then try to figure out what unemployment meant for them within this context of, at that time, people talked about Korea as this kind of emerging economy. And then the financial crisis hit, and this was a failing capitalist experiment. It was a, crony capitalism, all of these other kinds of words. And so it was an interesting point to kind of explore the meanings around unemployment for these very masculine factory workers. So.
And I know that you write about that as well in the volume, and we'll get to that. I wanted to ask, Carrie, when you were working on A Company of One, were there references or resources that you found in anthropology that shaped your thinking? I mean, A Company of One kind of in many ways kicks off what I see as the subfield as it is today. So what were you working with?
I would say that probably the most influential works that I was drawing on was Catherine Newman. So anthropologist Catherine Newman. She was actually my advisor's advisor. So my intellectual grandmother, I would say. And she had written a book about downward mobility. And one chapter of that is an ethnography of a job seekers club, the 40 plus job seekers club. And that was the first time I had ever read about that kind of group. And she offers a really nuanced, fascinating analysis. And one of the things that was really in my mind when I went into the field, again, not planning on studying unemployment, but hers was the narrative of unemployment that I understood. And so many of her findings were still completely relevant, but there was also something different going on in terms of, I don't know that for the most part, I would describe unemployment as a crisis in the same way, partly because of the time period, partly because of the nature of high tech, where job change was always more common, and partly some of the cultural shifts that I trace around ideas about masculinity, ideas about, what it means to be a fully, realized human and how that extends beyond work, that some of those things were just really changing. And I think have changed even more since my book. So although I appreciate your kind words, I really see my work as following in the footsteps of some of the previous qualitative research around studies of work and also of job loss and unemployment.
Absolutely. But I think as you're pointing out, there was a moment, in the late 90s, early 2000s, where it seems like people had really started to internalize the kind of temporality of the new unemployment, this kind of, as Sennett talks about, this idea of no long term. And the folks that you're writing on to a much greater extent have internalized that. JB, how about you? Resources, references that you were drawing on when undertaking your work in Korea?
This might sound a little too odd because it is, again, very much following Carrie. One of the first books that I picked up when I came back from the field was Catherine Newman's Falling from Grace. And there's a chapter on blue collar workers. And that helped me to begin to think about what it could mean and what can unemployment say about the larger social cultural shifts in South Korea. And in addition to that, I think at that time, there's two interesting strands. So there was that older sociological literature on deindustrialization, and just kind of figuring out, okay, what is happening politically, economically, looking at these kind of blue collar communities. Then there's the social psychological work around the effects of unemployment on these kinds of populations. And then, of course, at that time was the surge in literature and theorizing of neoliberalism, right? And so those two strands is what I was trying to kind of straddle. And partly with the neoliberal part was that the financial crisis was a kind of watershed moment in modern South Korea, in the sense that it really cemented neoliberal policy, neoliberal economic structures in South Korea. Prior to that, there was fairly strong unions, almost near guarantee of lifetime employment for a very specific strata of workers. All of that really began to crumble in the mid-90s. And so my book was trying to kind of track that through this specific population.
And it sounds like maybe you saw anthropology as being in the position to weave these different threads together.
I think why I was drawn to anthropology in the first place, because it is so eclectic, that I can draw from so many different theorists, subfields, and try to weave a narrative to explain all of that. And in the kind of anthropology I'm really drawn to, I think that, for example, from the chapter in the edited volume is really looking at how to theorize the kind of the intimate experience of these larger social structural disruptions. And so anthropology, I think, provides a broad canvas to work with, I think.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the collaboration that led to Anthropologies of Unemployment. Where did that begin? Did you know each other? Where did you kind of encounter one another? Where did the idea for this volume come from?
I think I just cold emailed Carrie. I read her book, and I was just thinking about what she was doing. And I think at that time, she might have been editing the Anthropology of Work section. And I thought this would be a very interesting person to get to know. And she was kind and generous enough to respond to this strange person emailing, I think. And I think we did a conference together and we got together. I think very luckily, we got a really nice group of scholars who came together, and it just went from there, I think.
For sure, it's good that you took the advice that they give in many job seeker courses about cold emailing, knocking on doors, putting yourself out there, that kind of stuff. So, Carrie, you signed on to the project, and what did the two of you want to accomplish with it? What did you want to say with the volume?
Well, I think one of the things that I was so excited about, first of all, I love emails from strangers asking me to do cool stuff. So, I mean, that was always a win. But I think one of the things that JB and I really connected on from the beginning, it was exciting to me to think about the ways in which what I was finding among a specific population during a certain historical moment within American culture. JB is exploring, we're touching on similar things, but in such distinct contexts. And the more we looked around, we saw there are scholars working in this field. Some we sort of knew, some I think we put out a call for the panel, and some folks connected with us that we had no idea about their work. Some were still writing their dissertations. So I think it was exciting. I had never seen people bring together, and it might exist out there, but I had never seen people come together and talk about the ways in which unemployment works and how it feels and how people talk about it and think about it and experience it in different cultural, national, occupational contexts. So that conversation was really exciting to me. And like you said, we put together a panel, and we found great scholars to work with. I mean, now I realize in retrospect, there were lots of other cool people working on Ofer Sharon's book came out after. I didn't know about his work at the time, right? There were other people doing this. And luckily, I bumped into somebody at a conference who had read our edited volume and said, I want to do a second one because I found 14 more people who are doing work around this. And that was so exciting to me, right? That they recognized that. So I think it was a nice chance for us to get a whole bunch of people in the room. And then like JB said, I mean, they're just a wonderful group. And so it was a pleasure to decide, let's take this panel, invite a few more folks into the mix, and see what kind of volume we can put together to bring all these voices together. And then if I could add one more thing, I think another goal in terms of the volume was always that we always saw that line between unemployment and employment as a very blurry one. And I think, in some ways it is blurred in new ways, and COVID has only exacerbated that, right? In some ways it's blurred in new ways. In other ways, it's always been blurrier than social scientists gave it credit for, right? So we wanted to look at the way in which that boundary between unemployment and employment was blurry and permeable. In fact, it was so blurry and permeable as to actually be like intellectually unhelpful, right? But if we think about I'm teaching Foucault in my theory and methods class. If we think about like Foucault's concept of how binary categories prevent us from like thinking in new ways, I think unemployment is one that does that. And so that volume was trying to like, not just say, hey, look, it's blurry, but like, what happens if we really question the very concept behind this being two different statuses and two different identities?
I love that. And I think that it really speaks to what is anthropological about the volume. I mean, the different chapters do it in different ways. But rather than, rejecting the category out of hand, you really do open it up and interrogate it. And I think what's really wonderful is that you should. And one of the chapters, and I'm going to forget the name of the author, writes about going beyond quantitative thinking, which I think is so critical to opening up this concept and the kind of broader world of experience that exists behind a figure like the unemployment rate, which really, as a social fact, is disguising as much as it reveals. As I've said to people before, unemployment in the United States versus unemployment in Norway versus unemployment in Tajikistan. These are entirely different things. People turn to different others for support and help. The kinds of rights and obligations are mapped very differently. The kinds of support that you can expect are very different. And the actual, social psychological effects of losing your job are very different. In some places, it is still maybe a crisis or a catastrophe, whereas for others, it's baked into the normal routines of being a human being. And I think that comes across very nicely in the book. Were there any points in writing the introduction together or in thinking about unemployment that the two of you disagreed on, or did you find that you were mostly on the same page?
I think we were mostly on the same page. I think I just have doing these kinds of projects, they're not necessarily always good experiences.
No.
Especially edited volumes and the like can be.
It's a diplomatic way to put it.
Tortuous. But Carrie was phenomenal to work with. And I think a lot of it is that I think we were very sympathetic to each other's theoretical perspectives. And as I think Carrie put it extremely well, that, the two things that I think that remains a value for that volume, if we can still pick it up, and hopefully other people continue to read it, is that one, it does offer that cross-cultural perspective. So in that sense, it's a very traditional anthropological project. The other part is, again, perhaps part of the traditional anthropological project in terms of theorizing, right? Blurring these kinds of binary oppositions that have historically structured that way we think. And rethinking that binary, I think, helped me to, I think, really resituate how we can frame unemployment, how people experience it, how it is, again, similar or different in many different places. And the last thing is that value of it is that I think, I'm not going to say that it's prescient or anything, but I think that it really does speak to the current moment. Mm-hmm. I think that our lives are deeply blurred. The idea of formal employment being the central pillar of structuring our life, I think, is no longer relevant for most people. And we see it in many other fields. And I think we see it in academia, in anthropology, that the lines are blurred in so many different ways. And I think there's some positives to that, but I think there's also some negatives. Thinking about sometimes maybe we want the lines to be less blurred, that we in some ways long for a greater structure, a greater separation between formal work, right, employment and unemployment. But at the same time, perhaps the blurring also allows us a modicum of freedom to rethink what it means to work and the centrality of work in what it means to be a human.
Well, the pandemic has certainly opened up those possibilities for thinking about where people want those boundaries to be. We have a lot of employment now that looks, like the way unemployment looked, a few years ago. I want to go briefly to your individual contributions in the volume because they're both really fascinating. We'll start with you, JB. You wrote about occupation in Korea. I know I'm putting you on the spot to come back up with what you think. Okay. You wrote about occupation in this really interesting way. You talk about kind of the situation of these bodies into the kind of laboring spaces, and then unemployment, if I'm getting correct, as a kind of a rupture, and the kind of tearing of these people out of, like I said, that environment into which they've been imbricated. So what were you trying to say with that chapter?
So I think there is a way in which people have written about class and especially manual labor. And especially from an academic perspective, I don't think that we do a very good job at being sympathetic to working class people in general. But then there's also this tradition, both in the social sciences and I think also philosophically, of looking at manual labor as simply a burden, toil, something that people disliked, they wanted to avoid. It was just a source of pain. I kind of wanted to flip that around and then paying attention to how people felt, how they experienced their unemployment, and understanding that their sense of self was so deeply tied, right? And not simply cognitively, but also deeply tied bodily to the work that they were doing, that being on the assembly line became a part of who they were. It formed their bodies. So there's one story in which one of the workers, after he was unemployed, after he got laid off, he had awful back pain. And there was some sort of structural damage because he used to kind of hang underneath the doors while he's trying to put the car doors in. And it was so fascinating because as he was telling this story, I said, well, how did you treat this, or how did you deal with this pain while you were working? And he realized that it didn't hurt when he was working, right? It was part of, there must have been some kind of pain, but that was part of what it was like to be a worker, right? But then to be pulled away from that context, to be pulled away in which that body I was so deeply shaped by that specific work, in which the thing and the body are separated. It really felt like, to many of the workers that I talked with, like being severed, to be really physically wounded. And that's what I really wanted to show. And in a way to say that, like work does things to us in very powerful ways. And yeah.
Absolutely. What comes through very clearly in the chapter and in the pain that lingers, the pain that, as you're pointing out, may have been dampened, becomes amplified in the absence of this constant relationship between the body and the workplace. I think it's a really marvelous contribution. Carrie, you write about the limits of liminality, obviously taking aim at a kind of classic anthropological concept there. So tell us a little bit about what you were trying to say.
Well, if you don't mind, before I answer that, I would
Of
love
course.
to say one more thing about the pragmatics of how an edited volume comes together.
Please, yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah,
okay.
We can't get enough of that.
So I'll say that, and then you're going to have to remind me what you actually just asked.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, so I just wanted to add, to what JB had said. I'm sure all edited volumes come together differently, but I think there is sort of a mystery about like how all this works sometimes. I certainly didn't know until I did one. And I am not, I would say, a natural born collaborator. I like my stuff done how I like it done. And but I think what really made this edited volume work is that JB and I and our contributors, we were sort of all led by a genuine intellectual curiosity and like an excitement about grappling into these topics together. So there really weren't any egos in the mix when it came to how to put it together. So for instance, I don't love theory, right? I do it when I have to, but JB really enjoys it. And so I'm very comfortable when we're writing that there are times when like I will take a step back because this is more his zone than mine, and then vice versa. And I think there really was that like mutual respect. And then in terms of working with collaborators, working with our contributors, for me, like the most important thing, and this is what I would tell anybody who wants to do an edited volume, and COVID makes it trickier, but was we met in person, right? We had our panel together at that AAA and at multiple AAAs after. We invited all of our contributors to join us for breakfast or lunch or whatever we could all make, so that we got to know each other as people and not just as, a chapter, right? The name attached to a chapter. And I think that made the process a lot more fun. It made us a lot more invested in all of the chapters that were part of the volume and not just our own. And I have to give a shout out to Katrin Lynch, who was one of our discussants, but who also worked with Jong Bum and I to revise the introduction in the midst of the revision process. And so like out of this volume, yes, we have this volume and I'm very proud of it. But I'm far more proud of like the relationships that came out, that I am still in touch with many of the contributors. I've written tenure letters for some of them. I have written letters of recommendations for new jobs for some of them. Jong Bum and I, our sons have met and played together, right? So I think like an edited volume is an opportunity to connect in ways beyond like on the printed page. And I just want to say that because that was what I found most fulfilling about that whole process.
I love this. This is, you're making the case for edited volumes, which is not a case that's made all too often. I think they have a pretty bad rap, and they can be a slog. They take a lot of time. Folks they don't always stick to their deadlines, but when they work, I think they're really, like this one does. I think they're really magnificent, and if they've catalyzed conversations that have kept all of you in contact with one another, I think that's really fantastic. And I think, it sounds like you got a great group of authors, but I remember when I saw this was coming out, my sense at the time was that you were just really tapping into what seemed like a zeitgeist, both in the field and during what was still, I think, kind of the recovery from the financial crisis. Late at that point, but you were on to something. And I think that it's not surprising to hear that you found a large and like-minded group of scholars that had things to say. And it's not surprising to hear that there are even more people that have wanted to write on this, because it's an incredibly rich area. And folks are either coming at it directly or, as was the case with you two, kind of tripping into it, going to their field sites and discovering that this is a far more prominent part of people's lives, and that there are stories to be told about unemployment that are not being told in the broader social sciences. So that's really great. And I'll add, I always welcome asides about the world, the world of publishing. I think people find that interesting. But Carrie, so your chapter, like I said, was on the limits of liminality, and you're kind of skewering a tried and true concept there. You want to just tell us a little bit about what you were getting at?
Well, I think the concept of liminality is an absolutely useful one, right? That, you have these moments in which you are between stable identities. I think that concept is incredibly useful in different ways. I just don't think it works here anymore, if it ever did, because it's not, if you've got a territory that the vast majority of people now visit, and many of them visit it multiple times over their lives and stay there for extended periods of time, it really stops making sense to call it like it's betwixt and in between. It's kind of a land of its own, right? And it's a land that more and more people have visited. And so I think honestly, when we think about the way unemployment has been talked about before, it's really only select group of people who ever had the privilege to have anything but that, right? So we have large swaths of the population in the US and elsewhere who have never in their lives and never will be securely employed in any sort of predictable way. So for some people, the idea that like one day I am working and the next day I am unemployed, it doesn't make any sense in their lived experience of what labor looks like and how their labor is valued and how it gets remunerated or doesn't get remunerated, right? So I think that model was kind of tied to this, the flash in the pan of the organization man of the 40s and 50s. Right. Like I always tell my students will always say, well, people used to be this way. Yeah, for maybe 20 years, a couple of people, right? But this is not like what work has looked like throughout, in my case, I study American culture and history. So I was really arguing that like unemployment has in some ways become a land of its own with its own logics and its own rituals and its own discourse. Mm-hmm. And like any culture, that culture is always changing. But I think it was sort of worth studying that space and the many other spaces to which it is adjacent. And those conversations, I didn't write about it in the same way people are now, but I think since then, the conversations around gig work and hustling and self-employment and solopreneurship and like all these kinds of conversations are really starting off where we left off in a way and carrying the anthropology of work, I think, in new directions. And to me, that's really exciting.
It's a sign that I think that you've chosen a great topic. If it almost seems like it needs a sequel right away because of everything that's happening. I wanted to ask, and I think you've covered this a little bit already. You are making with this volume and with your work I'd like to think kind of a uniquely anthropological contribution to the social science of unemployment, but what would you say is that contribution?
So I think one of the things that I think, Kelly, that I love that anthropology brings to these conversations, because sociology has been doing amazing stuff around work. So many of the scholars I engage with are qualitative sociologists of work, some quantitative folks thrown in there, but I think sociology really has made huge contributions in this area. But I think what anthropologists do, or maybe we're not the only ones who do it, but I think we do it really well, is to bring in the voices of workers themselves, right? So it's not about dropping workers into different categories. Are they this kind of worker? Are they that kind of worker? But actually sort of hearing how they talk about work and its absence and how it feels to them, the different meanings they impart to it, the way it feels different, even like JB writes about, even at a bodily level, the way it feels different depending on cultural context and historical context. And I think anthropology, we're just at our best, on our good days, we are really good at connecting people's own words and experiences with the contexts in which they're occurring, right? So trying to make sense of the interplay between those things, that individual experience and the situation that is shaping it, and the way in which those things are shifting and changing all the time around us. So I think to me, that's the central anthropological contribution, but I'd love to hear what JB has to say on that too.
I think there's something about stories and listening to people's stories. And, for us who are able to, before the pandemic, to do field work, to be with people and not just hanging out, but you're hanging out, but that kind of relationship, right? And really seeing what that experience feels like to them, as Carrie was saying. And then there's, again, this kind of broader tradition of holism, that these stories are situated in this larger social historical, context, and that these cultural forms, so be it gender, sexuality, class, employment, that they all interconnect in very interesting and subtle ways. And for anthropologists to figure out the way that it's configured in a very interesting way in a specific location, right? I think that's what we do, and that's what we do the best. I kind of want to address a little bit what we talked about before in terms of some of the things that this volume has done, and hopefully that it can do. And I was thinking about, because I also teach a lot of urban anthropology at Webster University. And oftentimes, for example, when we talk about, for example, the quote unquote ghettos, right? We talk about these kind of urban places. We pathologize it in a very interesting way. But what would happen if we took this unemployment framework, right? Rather than racializing it and pathologizing it in that manner, I think it would provide a much more theoretically nuanced way of thinking about how people live in different places. And as Carrie mentioned, this idea that formal employment, this 9 to 5, working for 30 years and then retiring, it is very much a Fordist dream. And for the vast majority of people, even in the United States, it was still a dream, right? It was only offered to a privileged population. And I think that this volume, I hope, because it is cross-cultural in its scope, provides that there's many different ways to look at this. That this American perspective, this European perspective, is not the only way to look at that experience.
So maybe we'll conclude by going to where things have gone since the volume. So if you were redoing your volume today, what kinds of issues would you feel like you need to include now? In the past 5 years, we've obviously had some things change globally. And while I think the book remains incredibly relevant, what topics, what issues, what questions would you want to make sure you engaged if you were doing it in 2021?
So before the pandemic, I was developing a new research project, and the focus is on aging. And the thing that I want to spend more time exploring is the way that we work and non-work fits into these larger ideas of the life cycle. And so thinking about the anthropology of aging, how that anthropology work can intersect very interesting ways in that way. So I started and connected with a population of, I wouldn't say retired, but people who left formal employment for a number of reasons, and focusing on these men who became, in some ways, not necessarily homeless, but they were living in these kind of single occupancy apartment slums. So there was this large population of men in their 40s and 50s and 60s who weren't necessarily laid off because they were unemployed for such a long time, right? That is, it becomes a different kind of life, a different way of figuring out how to live, and then how that connects in such interesting ways to this broader politics of aging in South Korea. And I guess the background is that South Korea is I guess you would call it a hyper aging society, right? So at some point very soon, there are going to be more people over 65 than people under it. So there's this concern about an unproductive population. So that's another interesting discourse around that. I think that's the way that I would approach it. And I think that the United States is also in this really interesting moment. I think the census showed that the population will not be reproducing itself given current trends and in reproduction. And in this challenge about thinking about what it means to retire, Katrin Lynch has a great book on retirement and the meaning of work, and trying to find meaning post work. So these are the larger questions that I think I would like to explore.
Absolutely. I think that, the demographic graying of various countries is raising all kinds of really interesting questions about who's going to do the work that needs to be done, and how are we going to how are we going to maintain welfare systems, for example, that are dependent on the taxes that are associated with formal employment? How about you, Carrie? What do you think would need to be looked at in a sequel done in 2021?
Well, I mentioned, I think, the idea of gig work, and gig work, whether organized through online platforms or not, right? This sort of notion of compiling together a lot of different income streams as a means of trying to achieve security in a world characterized by precarity, right? So I think that's really interesting. But of course, I mean, the elephant in the room is COVID, right? I mean, I think as tragic as this moment has been in so many ways, it has also opened up conversations around work in a way that, like, we anthropologists of work have been always having. This is what we love to do, but like nobody else cared. And the fact that like neighbors of mine know what universal basic income is and are actually contemplating it as something maybe the United States is going to do, like that is a game changer. So I think the way in which COVID has, created new categories of work, essential versus non-essential, the way that it has prompted some Americans to really be thinking about like, not just what do our work lives look like, but what do we want them to look like as we rebuild them, hopefully, coming out of this moment? What does it mean when you have such huge levels of unemployment and to take David Karjanen's point about like how useless those numbers really are, right? What does it mean we have so many people who are either underemployed or working part-time and want to be full-time, or working full-time and desperate to be part-time? And where do the kids and elder parents go during that? Like what happens with everybody else? Like, I just think we're in this really exciting moment. So the volume would probably have to be about 47 more chapters long this new version. And I also think the nice thing about writing a book is you figure out everything you missed. And so it has been exciting in the years since the book came out, like I said, to meet so many scholars whose work touches on exactly what we're interested in. And if we hadn't put this book together, I would never have met them. Of course, retroactively, I want to like put their work in there. But it is an exciting thing that this book has been, at least, one spoke on this broader wheel around conversations about work and unemployment today.
That's fantastic. And, it's one of the reasons I asked both of you about, references and resources that you drew on in your own work, because I do think that a research community or a scholarly community or a subfield can emerge out of, if a group of people share a system of references or authors that they're in dialogue with. And I think that this book has become that for those of us that are interested in unemployment. Fortunately for all of us, the volume was not the end of the conversation, but something that pushed it forward. And I expect we'll see a lot of excellent work in the years to come. So Carrie and JB, thank you so much for joining us on Mergers and Acquisitions, and we will look forward to following your work further.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.